Every time we turn on the news or scroll through Facebook, it seems like we see another story of a politician or athlete or celebrity getting into trouble. And for most of us, these scandals have become white noise. But for me, when a scandal breaks, I get completely wrapped up in the frenzy. And what I find most fascinating is not what a scandal reveals about a high-profile person, but what it reveals about us. If you listen to talk radio, every caller is obsessed with fairness. If someone does something wrong, it only seems fair that they have to pay for it. What's ironic is that while we have this standard for others, we never have it for ourselves. Think about it. In fact, when it comes to our own mistakes, failures, and sins, we just want grace. We'd never say it this way, but I think all of us want grace for ourselves, but we want justice for others. If I'm being honest here, I'd hoard all of the grace in the world, and I'd appoint myself as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and here's why. I think I'm really good at deciding who's wrong, and what their punishment should be. At the same time, I'm exceptionally good at pleading my case when I need grace. When it comes to someone else, I call their explanation for bad behavior an excuse. When it comes to me, I call my explanation for bad behavior a reason. I don't make excuses, I have reasons. And I bet that most of us here would think the same thing. Knowing that, let's jump back into the story we've been reading for the past few weeks. In the story of the prodigal son, Jesus lets us know that in the first sentence of the story that the father has two sons. They both get lost for very different reasons. The older brother, who we're going to look at today, has the same tendency you and I do. In other words, we can relate to him, even if we don't feel like we can. Why? Because he wants grace for himself and justice for his brother. As you'll recall from the last few weeks, Jesus told the story of the prodigal son to two groups of people who hated each other, the Pharisees and the tax collectors. The Pharisees, on one hand, were angry with the tax collectors because they were extortionists, and they were upset with Jesus because he was eating meals with the extortionists. In that time and place, eating a meal with someone gave them dignity, even when the person didn't deserve it. The tax collectors, on the other hand, while they were stealing from their brothers and sisters, were also tired of being judged by the Pharisees for working with the Romans. Dishonesty aside, they were simply trying to support their families. In response to all of that, Jesus told some stories. As you can imagine, the story of the prodigal son was the pinnacle. At this point, we've talked about the younger brother. After all, he is the prodigal. He's the guy who made prodigal son a household phrase. He's the one who woke up in a pig pen and then walked home to a party. Now we're going to be introduced to the older brother. Let's pick up the story after the prodigal has arrived home. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother had been away in the field for quite some time. We aren't sure how long. As he was walking back into the village, he heard a drum beat. He knew, like the audience did, that a drumbeat didn't signal a funeral. Nope, someone had gotten the party started. But as he got closer, he shockingly realized that the party wasn't happening in a random location. It was happening at his house. The last thing on this guy's mind was that his little brother was home. But that's exactly what one servant told him, that his brother was home, safe and sound. On the surface, it reads like a health report. The younger brother got roughed up in a distant country, but he's fine now. At a deeper level, however, there's a spiritual meaning to safe and sound. Essentially, the older brother discovered that his younger brother was received with peace. In other words, the father and the son had been reconciled. There wasn't a penalty, there wasn't repayment. Before hearing this, the older brother might have thought that if there was a party for his brother today, he'd be going to rehab tomorrow. But the servant told him that this wasn't the case. The father had brought the son back into the family. At this point, I imagine Jesus would lean into the Pharisees in the crowd and say, "You don't get to decide how God distributes grace, and you don't get to decide who God is going to distribute grace to." Once the older brother realized what was going on, this happened. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." The audience who heard this lived in a patriarchal society, which meant all honor was given to fathers. You never question your dad. So the natural assumption is that the party isn't for the younger brother, it's for the father. Why? Because he's gotten what he wanted. Both of his sons are back under his roof. Certainly, they're not there to celebrate the younger brother. After all, he hasn't done anything. In fact, there are probably a lot of people at the party who don't even like the little brother. They're there to celebrate the costly love of the father and how it has reconciled him to his son. And if you were the oldest son and your father was throwing a party, you had two choices. First, you could go to the party, even if you were less than thrilled, put a smile on your face, and stuff your anger deep down. Or you could pull your dad into a spare room and ask him, "Is my brother going to go to rehab tomorrow?" What you cannot do in a patriarchal culture, however, is stomp your foot, rage out of control, and refuse to go into the party. That would be deeply shameful. But that's exactly what the older brother did. Jesus is telling us a story about a father who had been shamed twice, for very different reasons. The assumption is that the younger brother was the problem child, and the older brother simply had some issues he needed to work through. The audience who heard the story, however, would know that both brothers shamed their father deeply and broke his heart. Essentially, Jesus was saying to the religious elite who was gathered, "You have broken relationship with God too." "My son," the father said, "you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The way Jesus ended the story is brilliant. We don't know what the older brother decided to do. This was Jesus' way of saying to the Pharisees, "The ball is in your court." He essentially asked them, "Are you going to keep stacking up your good deeds and acting like you don't need grace?" I imagine there were Pharisees who walked away offended, and I imagine there were tax collectors and prostitutes who stood there weeping. That's because there's something about grace that's offensive. If we've never been offended by it, we've never really thought about it. There's something about grace that rattles our grace for me, justice for them paradigm. Jesus told a story about a father who said, "Grace for you and grace for them." That doesn't make sense. One theologian, Robert Farrar Capon, calls grace divine insanity. To the extent that we get offended by grace is the extent that we can be comforted by it. God doesn't withhold grace from the people who we withhold grace from. We crave a merit and demerit system. We want to know that we're justified in thinking that we're better than someone else. But the prodigal son story changes that. The story shows that everyone gets in through the same door. The cross has paid the bill for everyone. Essentially, Jesus was saying that the scoreboard has been turned off. If you've been hanging around church for a while, we like keeping score. Churchgoers are professional scorekeepers. And with that in mind, here's the good news. At the heart of Jesus' most famous story, there's a message for you. It doesn't matter how bad you've been. God's grace is for you. At the heart of this story, there's divine insanity. Why? Because it doesn't matter how good you've been either. In one sweep, Jesus has taken away our ability to ever feel like we're better than someone else. For me, this is troubling on two levels. One, I tend to overestimate how good I am. I have an inflated level of my morality. It's that inflated perch that allows me to criticize others. But the prodigal son story doesn't just welcome sinners, it dismantles moral superiority. And second, I tend to compare myself to others to feel better about myself. Let's be honest, depending on who we're comparing ourselves to, we can start to feel pretty moral. We crave a dividing line. Jesus told this story to say that there's no line between the clean and the unclean. There's no dividing line between those who deserve grace and those who deserve justice. At some point, we've all been on both sides of that line. If you need a dividing line, make it between God and everyone else. There's God, and there's people who need the grace of God. There's God, and there are sinners. We're not worse than other people, and we're not better either. I was recently reminded of this idea at a theme park of all places. A few years ago, I found myself at Disney's Hollywood Studios with my 5-year-old and 3-year-old sons. At that time, my oldest son crossed the threshold of height, which means he's now tall enough to ride Rocket Roller Coaster. My 3-year-old was barely too short. On that trip, my 5-year-old spent the day telling our 3-year-old that he's too short. I kept asking him to stop, but he didn't. Finally, I sat him down and said, "You can't call someone short." Of course, he wanted to know why. "Because you're short too," I told him. I think God looks at us like this sometimes. We argue over who's tall enough and who's too short. And God thinks to himself, "You're all too short. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We talk about God's glory in church, not because God is so shiny, but because He's so different from us. His ways are higher than ours. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. But when it comes to people, our thoughts and ways aren't that much higher than someone else's. So as we wrap up this series, think about the character you relate to the most. Have you been standing on either side of the dividing line? Who's a person in your life everyone avoids? Or who's on the wrong side of the line? Who's someone who you hope gets justice? That's exactly the person you need to run to, like this father ran to this son. That's the person who needs not just to hear this story, but to experience this story through you. When we really begin to understand grace, we'll naturally become increasingly comfortable around sinners. At the same time, when we understand grace as a gift instead of a concept, sinners will become increasingly comfortable around us. Isn't this what Jesus modeled? When we understand this, a sinner becomes someone not in need of justice, but grace. As believers, we become compelling because we truly understand that it doesn't matter how bad you've been or even how good you've been. No matter what side of the line you're on, God's grace is for you.